All right, thanks so much, Michael, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Aperture, for hosting us today and inviting us to think and look together. And just want to extend thanks to Stephanie Tung, Brendan Emser, my editors for this issue, and also thank you, Alex Schlechter, for programming this event and bringing it together so quickly and beautifully. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then say a few words about my piece to kind of set the terms of our conversation around the home, interiority, and staying in Asian American photography. So we have four wonderful artists with us today. Miraj Patel is an artist and designer based in New Haven, Connecticut. This past May, he graduated with an MFA from Yale University School of Arts Photography program. Patel's work has been internationally featured in Aperture, Lens Scratch, PH Museum, and PhotoSpark. He was a 2021 Aperture Portfolio Prize finalist for his series Back East and a winner of the Aperture Fujifilm Commission. We also have Jarod Liu. He is a Chinese-American artist and photographer currently based in New Haven. His work explores themes of identity, community, and displacement. One of his projects, Please Take Off Your Shoes, was shortlisted for the Aperture Portfolio Prize in 2021 and is currently in a group exhibition at SF MoMA titled Kinship, Photography, and Connection. Liu created a new body of work commissioned by Aperture in partnership with Fujifilm in 2022, resulting in the series In Between You and Your Shadow, which examines his relationship with his mother and her past. And we'll talk more about these works. And we also have Julie Quon. Born and raised in Chinatown, New York, Julie is a photographer based in Queens. She was previously communications director for Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and more recently has taken on the role of communications director for the philanthropic investment organization Stardust. She earned her BA in architecture from Columbia University and completed the International Center of Photography Certificate Program in 2011. Her interest lies in exploring the concepts of environment, identity, and intimacy, and her photographs frequently feature her family as subjects of her work. And last but not least, we have Arthur Oh, who is a Taiwanese-American artist and educator based in Queens, New York. His work has been featured in Art Forum, Art in America, New York Times, The New Yorker, and Aperture, as well as Blind Spot, Camera, Austria, and others. He has written critical texts as well for Aperture, Art in America, Foam, and Osmos. And his publications include the artist's book, The World is All That Is the Case. And he's an associate professor of photography here at Parsons. So thank you, the four of you, so much for being here. Before we open up the conversation, I wanted to say some words about my piece in the issue, since it's a quite kind of broad historical piece that spans 100 years and features 7 case studies of both historical and contemporary photographers. And I also wanted to kind of introduce the key term of the talk, staying in, and kind of clarify what's at stake in us thinking about this concept of staying in relation to Asian American photography. So I began this project. Here's my screenshot of my piece with Miraj's beautiful work in the cover spread. So I began this project kind of in search of photographic traces of what I call Asian American interiority, taking the interior in 3 senses, interior spaces, states, and relations. Because I felt like there were images, I mean, as someone who is Asian American, I felt like there were images that were missing from the history of American photography, also speaking as someone who's training as an academic and art historian. And I felt like there were also images missing from mainstream Asian American visual culture, which is still too often confined by expectations and tastes of an outside public. And so I wanted to actually read kind of the opening excerpt of my article, which explains why this idea of staying in is so interesting. And this focuses on one of my historical examples, the photographer Irene Poon. A panel of solid black is interrupted by fragments of human form. An elderly woman stepping halfway into the frame, her expression animated by something in the dark. Taken in 1969 in San Francisco's Chinatown, this photograph reflects a mode of looking unconcerned with accommodating the needs of an outside viewer, registering instead rich stretches of ordinary life as darkness. The artist, Irene Poon, spent many years photographing the neighborhood of her youth. Poon's most striking compositions feature dense black areas that shroud and fragment her subjects, like blind spots made visible. Often, the enveloping blackness shows up as background while figures linger at thresholds, doorways, balconies, windows, a recurring motif marking the unseen interiors from which they emerge and into which they can retreat. Poon usually lets in just enough details to suggest that the negative spaces aren't empty, but rather full of presences we can't see. Curiously, Poon honed this aesthetic of visible invisibility just as the political awakening of the Asian American movement swept through the campuses of the Bay Area and beyond, including Poon's own alma mater of San Francisco State College. What does it mean at this historical moment to turn one's camera towards the banal details of ordinary life, to center the familial figures of children and grandparents, and what's more, to allow them to go dark? If the Asian American movement sought to forge a clear political identity for Asians in the United States as multi-ethnic, oppositional, anti-assimilative, then Poon's work opens onto the obverse, the messy, exploratory, unfinished private spaces and relations that sustain such acts of public self-definition. If Asian America is built on generations of activism, Poon's shrouded compositions remind us that it is also built on generations of what the performance scholar Summer Kim Lee calls staying in. So this is kind of what's at the heart of this talk and my piece. So staying in, writes Lee, quote, critiques the compulsory sociability and relatability demanded of minoritarian subjects to go out, come out, and be out. To stay in isn't to cut off relations with others, but only to refuse to be relatable. That is, to act in ways that conform to the standards and values of an outside public. For Asian Americans, to stay in means to slip out of our assigned roles within a visibility predicated on binaries of injury and protest, trauma and resilience, as entrenched as ever in the era of anti-Asian hate. Staying in opens up other registers of sociality, of rest, pleasure, play. It encapsulates the banal, domestic, familial spaces and relations that make up the substance of our lives, but leave little trace in history. So this is just a bit of an intro. Thanks for indulging the reading of my piece, and I hope this gives you a better idea of why I found this idea of interiority and staying in so critical in our current moment and also in relation to the just history of Asian America. So I wanted to also quickly just take you give you some glimpses of the background of my research. Since it did kind of take a long time, I had this idea actually around this time last year, and my research coincided with a couple of really great exhibitions in the Bay Area that kind of gave me a lot of inspiration and formed the crux of my case study. So there was a show at the Cantor Art Center that I went to see, curated by Maggie Detloff, and another show at San Francisco State University Gallery with Irene Poon, and there was this historical show at MoCA, curated by Herb Tam. Thank you, Herb, for telling me about this show. And actually, this show, which was in 2012, called America Through a Chinese Lens, is where I first learned about Julie and Arthur's work. So these works have been kind of in circulation for a long time. So these, you've seen these just now, sort of installation shots from the Cantor Art Center show. And I also dug through the archives at SF MoMA and Stanford to look at some archival material related to my historical artists. And these were some other texts and scholarship that I looked at and that were really formative to my thinking, if anyone's interested in further reading. I wanted to especially highlight the work of Tifu. Her 2 books, Whirring Visions and Picturing Model Citizens, both were so good and kind of really drew my attention to the importance of vernacular photography and the family photo album in relation to photography by Asians and Asian Americans, and especially since I was doing research actually as part of the Amile exhibition at MoMA, where I was working as a research fellow. Her book Whirring Visions kind of really blew my mind, just looking at a different photographic history of the Vietnam War, but that's a tangent. And also Bhakarathi Mani's work, Unseen Empire. She also has a piece featured in the current issue, really thoughtful piece on the uses of archive by several South Asian American artists. And Marcy Kwong, who's co-director of Asian American Art Initiative at Stanford, gave a wonderful lecture on May's Photo Studio. It's on YouTube and was really formative to my thinking as well. So I just wanted to introduce some of my research. But without further ado, let's turn to our panelists. And I wanted to actually open up with a pretty broad question, since I've been talking about staying in, and all of you, I think, literally stayed in to make the works that are featured in this Aperture issue. And so I wanted to ask what staying in means to you, the act of staying in, as whether it's as a photographic subject, a way of seeing, a mode of image making, or just a state of mind. What does staying in mean to you in your life and your practice? And I'll click through the images as you speak, and we can return to them later as well. And also feel free to ask each other questions, since we want it to be a free-flowing conversation. So, Miraj, do you want to start?
Hi. Yeah, sure. I think. Can you guys just hear me? Yeah. So a lot of the work that was featured in the magazine and kind of this project was actually made during the pandemic. It was a time where I was actually living with my parents, and it allowed me the capacity to go back and visit home in a certain way and be inside. That I think had me contend with a lot of like the residual stuff of assimilating, because I moved to this country when I was 5, and in the process, I realized that there was a lot of play involved with being inside as I had moved to this country with my parents. And while being at home, it allowed me to explore like the joys of play, but also kind of take on some of the other undertones of assimilation in a way that was actually really like helpful to work through some of that stuff. And I feel like having seen all your work as well, I feel like in all of it, there's like elements of play. And so I don't want to just like talk about play, but if you guys, someone else wants to also talk about like play in their work, I feel like even with your daughter, Arthur, there's like play involved, right? With the binoculars and stuff. I don't know if that's something you were also thinking about.
Well, I think we could go to that picture, but I think the work that I chose to show here, well, first of all, it's great to be on stage with all of you. It's great to meet a few of you in this occasion. And but in terms of the work that I wanted to show that hopefully responds to this notion of staying in, this work, well, so this work I did make during the pandemic, and it was about working with children. And I think all along, I think one of the things that we talked about earlier is about how older work, how we relate to older work from the perspective of the present. And I think for me, making work has been thinking about how to orient myself through making. And I think in this sense, it's working with children to think through these ideas of location or positionality, or where one is in a sense. And then the work that I made for the Taipei Biennial, I think you were saying thinking through the domestic through play. I think I was trying to, there was the point when my family moved to the States when I was 11, and there was a point when I was trying to figure out whether I was I still retained my Taiwanese identity versus a more American identity, and I think at that point I started this work, which was a set of still lifes and a installation with a replica of the fireplace in my parents' house. And so I think it was thinking through, not so much through play, but trying to respond to these elements that maybe contain some sense of identity for my family once they left Taiwan when I was younger. So.
Yeah, and we'll definitely try to touch on the issue of reception, especially a lot of your works come from different points in time. So Arthur and Julie, your works were made kind of over 10 years ago, and then we have more recent works by Miraj and Jarod. So I want to hear about how the meanings of those works have changed over time, but let's try to introduce everyone first. Jarod, do you want to speak a bit about staying in and what it means to you, and maybe the element of play as well?
Yeah, the project that's in the issue right now, In Between You and Your Shadow, was really a project that I worked on kind of during the pandemic, maybe post-lockdown, and it was about dealing with not knowing about my mom's past as Vincent Chin's fiance, all within the domestic space of my parents' house. So I was really thinking about play and memory as a way to re-perform some of the things that stuck out in my mind when it came to my childhood and living and dealing and experiencing that home. And I used the space as like a studio. I like re-performed a lot of mundane memories that typically were events that my parents did not remember. So like I would have them sit there and perform for the camera, and they're like, "No way, Dad did that. Like, I don't believe it." And then I would show them on camera, and then they were like, "Oh shoot, like Dad totally did that." And it was this like conversation between that kind of memory of re-performing for a picture that I really enjoyed. And I think it ultimately ended up being a lot of revisiting trauma and also a lot of play at the same time.
Julie, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, sure. So the work I made here was actually while I was still a student at ICP. So it was about 10 plus years ago. And the reason I chose the space was because I was actually living with my parents at the time. And so there was sort of really easy access to kind of spend time and find these sort of moments of, I guess, like portraiture of them, realizing that, they've been living there for about 30 plus years. And I mean, most of that apartment is their space. And I kind of like lived in a 10 by 10 room, but all the elements and the objects were really indicative of them. So just kind of trying to capture those, because they're a lot older than me. So I was thinking a lot about their aging and just like, how do I kind of mark this moment of me also kind of being in their space. And yeah, doing these like still lifes, I guess, yeah.
Right, and just building on that, I wanted to hear more about this question of how to photograph privacy, because as we've been talking about, the home is by definition a private space. It's where we go to kind of shed our public lives, our public selves, where we can go dark, experiment, rest, and play. So how do you bring the camera into such a space while preserving all that is kind of messy and unfinished, heterogeneous, incongruous, maybe untranslatable in the case of Asian American homes? I think especially, because I think a set of recognizable, standardized iconography hasn't really emerged for Asian American homes, maybe given the vast diversity of this identity category. So how do you photograph such a space and preserve that sense of privacy and preserve all of its kind of complexity and particularity against the pressure to have to explain yourself on someone else's terms? And maybe we can start with Jarod and Julie, because both of you do this, make this move of kind of obscuring faces and, obscuring a whether through uses of lighting or composition, camera angle. So how do you kind of navigate this tension between visibility, invisibility, and, do this protective gesture of preserving privacy in your work?
Well, for me, I think for the project In Between You and Your Shadow, it was a creative tactic for my mom to be photographed, because after being in the spotlight of Vincent Chin and kind of disappearing from that history and wanting to have a private life, it was the only way I could photograph my mom in a comfortable way. So a lot of the times when I'm hiding her face, it was in respect of that privacy. And because it was a conversation and a collaboration between me and my mom and myself and my parents and my family, it was this compromise between her not letting me know about this past or her past and me wanting to know. So like the result of all that was the photographs. It was in the entryway for that was because of it was the obscuring of the face. It was obscuring and respecting that privacy that my mom holds tight to this day.
Yeah, and so this series has its own portfolio in the issue, but you also have a different series from earlier, where I think you go into the homes of friends, strangers, and relatives. I don't know if you want to speak a bit about this one and if there's maybe a different relationship to these spaces and the privacy of people maybe outside of your family, or different strategies around that.
Yeah, so I started off photography as like a high school portrait photographer. My partner at the time, her grandma had a dream about me, so I kind of got thrown into portrait photography through this dream. And I think working as a portrait photographer and going into, Asian American homes and photographing friends and strangers and family members, I kept coming up with this question of like, what makes this photograph Asian American if I turned this person's face around? And I think it was after like 10 or so portraits outside, inside, against the white walls, against, bedroom posts, it really made me question, what I was really doing. So after, realizing that these portraits didn't speak to the complexities of the picture, of the experience that I was having as an Asian American, I really looked at the objects and signifiers that lived in these spaces and how those can create narratives that can speak to these complexities of like invisibility, interiority, and alienation, and So I think for me that was the challenge. Was like, if I take this person's face away, what makes this photograph about our experience? And it was just creative ways of trying to do that.
Julie?
Yeah, so photographing, honestly, I kind of did it in secret for a while. Like with my parents out, I would kind of photograph the space, and then after a while, as I started getting into it, they kind of were like, what are you doing? Like, what's interesting about the chair? I don't get it. But I think in terms of, what Jarod's saying about like what makes the image like feel Asian or feel Asian American, when I made the work, it was more like a personal kind of like exploration. But as like other people started to look at the images, it was sort of interesting because they were like, oh, this feels very, Asian. And I'm like, well, yeah, I'm Asian, but, I don't think I was like thinking to mind like there were certain visual cues or like a shared kind of like language of like, I think there's an image of like the shrines. Tommy, I think, did one, and it's like all this aluminum foil lined stove. And I'm like, that is my stove at home. Things like the remote control covered in plastic. Those are like sort of like very kind of like moments that as other people start to look at these images, kind of like started to relate in this like really specific way. And so I think in that way, it's sort of like called to this sort of imagery being kind of like an Asian American sort of story, which honestly I wasn't thinking about at the time, but it sort of evolved that way too.
So I have two related questions that any of you can answer, but I think a few of you play with strategies of performance and reenacting of memory. Miraj, I know you are quite performative in your series. And so there's kind of self-portraiture happening and sort of these bodily interventions into the spatial logic of the suburban Southern California house of your parents. So I'm curious about performance and restaging as a strategy for interacting with the home space and what kind of effects that creates.
So I guess like I was dealing with a lot of past memories. So regardless of however I was going to work my parents into doing this with me, it was going to be a performance. So I feel like that I didn't really want to hide those elements. It was more like, okay, like a lot of the acts of assimilation are performance, right? So if I'm going to go back on these notes of my past and their past of us trying to figure things out, like why try to hide it, right? It's like full of friction. It's not necessarily like a very clean or like there's a lot of friction in the process, right? So why in the images should I try to hide it or make it seem as if it's something that it's not? So I feel like performance and being very clear, like looking into the camera or, being kind of direct with it felt like, there's no honesty in photography, but it felt to me like more honest, in a way. So I think that's why maybe there's more tones of just like clear performance in there for me.
Well, could you talk about this specific picture? Because it's so actually playful, going back to what you were saying before about play. What's happening here? Are you restaging something?
Yeah, so when I was a kid on Sunday mornings, I would get into bed with my parents and watch cartoons. And I feel like in looking back into my childhood, maybe I didn't put enough like weight into those moments of joy and those moments of connecting with them. And during the pandemic, I had to move back in with them. So I was like, okay, like this is a lot different than when we got here, but it's like still the same kind of gesture. Like now we have Theo, right, the dog, and like, yeah. So that was kind of me trying to also like use photography as a way to go back and maybe readjust some of those things in my relationships to them, those memories.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think I touched on this in my article too in relation to you guys' work and also Tommy Ka's work, Tommy who's here today. This idea of the camera as a tool for reorienting the way we see our home, maybe allowing us to re-envision things that we're too familiar with. But I think I wanted to have a follow-up, Miraj, about, I think in our conversation, you had mentioned having this maybe antagonistic relationship to the space of the home, which I think is a bit different from Jarod and Julie's work. And again, I feel like this gesture of performance of trying to misuse different rooms and different parts of the house, doing things you're not supposed to, kind of like wreaking havoc and causing chaos. Could you say a bit more about this maybe kind of rebellious impulse that's here in these performative gestures, and what kind of impulse, what is animating that? What kind of maybe rebellious energy towards pressures of assimilation that's associated with this particular space of this house?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's rebellion. I think it's more play. And I think maybe my play comes off as a little more rebellious. But it was kind of, I don't know. I don't know if I would necessarily say it was an act of rebellion. Maybe it was partially because like my parents in their form of assimilating was to like own like a house, do this, do that. And it felt like they weren't asking enough questions as to why they were doing some of these things. And coming into adulthood myself, it became aware, like I started questioning these things, right? So going back into their space and I guess maybe forcing them sometimes to be in these images was a little antagonist, being kind of an antagonist. But yeah, I don't know if that kind of answered your question. But
yeah, I think what I meant by rebellion, I think you're maybe trying to foreground these senses of incongruity and tension between yourself, maybe your parents, and the surrounding space. And maybe, I think we had talked about this site of this middle-class house as a symbol of upward mobility, a symbol of assimilation. And I appreciate how you try to kind of insert yourself into that and complicate that.
Yeah. I have a follow-up if that's cool.
Okay. Yeah.
So I guess I was looking at a lot of photo books at the time, and like when I was talking to people, Larry Sultan would come up all the time, and I'd look at the book, right, and I'd be like, that is not my experience at all, right? So I feel like in going back into it, like not just trying to create some new fiction with my family, but also kind of like make it feel like it wasn't very congruent was kind of something I was thinking about, you know, to kind of like really try to like break the fabrication of what it looks like. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it comes through. It's nice. And I don't know if you guys had comments about performance and reenactment. I know that Jarod, you also kind of partake in this. There's one reenacted scene that I love, this karaoke scene. I think you said this was at your aunt's house, and when I saw it, it actually reminds me of some of our family scenes when you see someone is singing and then there's this little boy in the foreground clearly not enjoying what's happening, and there's this disconnect between maybe the two generations. But do you want to speak about this photograph a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think like as we're talking about this interior space and it being like this safety from like assimilation and the safety where you could like kind of shed off your own skin. I think for me, what I've noticed while photographing in these spaces that like it's not necessarily always the case. Like for me, going in and like we're kind of born into these spaces and forced to live it and experience it, but there are often times where you do feel alienated within that space, just like you feel alienated when you leave the interior space. So I think a lot of my work pushes that and makes that apparent, where there's this uncomfortable middle ground that we're kind of navigating, all while trying to, be out in the world and be productive and whatever. But I think like for this picture, it kind of describes that alienation and this inability to shed off that skin that we kind of have to perform in, whether it's outside or inside.
And I think you had mentioned this was something that actually happened at a family gathering, and you wanted them to restage it for this photograph.
Yeah. I was at a barbecue during the pandemic, and it was very quiet at one point, and I'm sitting outside with cousins, and all of a sudden I hear someone screaming inside the living room, and I walk inside, and it's my aunt singing, and my cousin was just sitting there like what the heck is going on? So, and sadly I did not have a camera, and I had to ask them to reperform that, and they were not happy.
Yeah, I think it's really kind of compositionally complex as well. There are different layers to the space, I think maybe marked by the two figures with their disparate activities and their kind of gazing away from each other, but you can see sort of the shelves full of Chinese statues and kind of in the shadow in the background. And I like how your aunt, I guess, is turned away from the camera. So again, there's that kind of protective gesture of giving her privacy, even as you're photographing her. So yeah, it's a wonderful picture.
Thank you.
Julie and Arthur, well, maybe you guys, maybe this next question is more relevant to your practice. I was interested in the use of still life in a lot of your work, I think a couple of your work, and this idea of using, objects as a way to hint at a human subject without revealing their face. So yeah, this idea of still life as portraiture what is your kind of approach to that, Julie and Arthur, if you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, spending 30 years in one space, you kind of start to, I think, see the objects as like reflections of the person. And so my mom she's very like clean. She loved wrapping things and layering things and covering things. She would just like repurpose like old items. So this is like my nephew's baby blanket. He grew out of it, but she decided to reuse it and cover, a washing machine. And I think just like these sort of gestures of them were always kind of there. So for me, it was always just sort of like capturing those moments. Like my dad by the window, he would always sneak cigarettes. So he would kind of hide it behind the radio, but you're like smoking out the window. You could smell it through the whole apartment. So he's not hiding anything. But, him standing by the window is sort of like the thing he does, And so when he was actually doing it, he actually like cooperated and let me, take a photograph of him. But it was sort of one of those things like we didn't necessarily have a discussion about privacy or like obscuring the face, aside from my mom, who was like, I don't want my photograph, like don't take a picture of my face. But I don't know with your mom, like if you had those discussions or it's just sort of inherent, like you just sort of knew you had to kind of have that protection. So
yeah, it's funny because with that in between you and your shadow, it was all about, she was like down to get photographed without her face being in it. But then there are moments during the photo shoot where she would just like kind of lay there like this and just like, okay, you could take a picture now, and I'll take a picture. And then, there's like, I have a variety of photographs of my mom obviously posing for the camera, and you could see her getting comfortable. But then when the shoots would end and we would just go do our thing, she would be like uncomfortable again getting photographed. So it is fun to see, I guess, our parents kind of play along in those like quick moments of, that I think to this day I won't ever forget. But Arthur?
Well, I think, today I was thinking about this idea of staying in, since that was sort of the premise of your article, and I was thinking that I was drawn to pictures that stay in, pictures that have some sort of interiority, and pictures that aren't overtly expressive. And I think for me, the still lives, especially the ones of the objects of my parents' house. This was a few years after I moved out of my parents' house, and then every time I go back, I would wonder why do they hold fast to these objects that many of them they brought with them from the move, and so I was thinking about whether these are extensions or things that extend from their self of the way that they see themselves outside of the context of where they came from. So I asked them if I could work with them in the space to set up almost like a studio, putting a backdrop up and then working with lights, and to isolate them in some ways, hoping to have a different orientation to them. So I think in some ways the idea of still life is trying to think about what their presence is like through the pictorial, through the photographic.
Yeah, I'm curious about this picture in particular. I'm really struck by the color and this quotidian object of the bowl just in this unusual setup. It's almost kind of looks like an excavation. Could you say a bit more about what's behind this photo?
Yeah, that's so funny. It's so long ago that I made this, but when I made the work, this was installation that was made for the Taipei Biennial, and I had thought of the installation as a single work, and I was working with, again, these objects from my parents' home. Who my dad's business at the time was to produce these products from China that they were ceramic objects, and I was thinking about these kinds of ubiquitous Chinese bowls that you could get from Chinese stores, and wanting to engage with it in some way. And the title of the installation is To Preserve, to Elevate, to Cancel, which is these three meanings that simultaneous meanings that are contradictory that Hegel identified in this word Aufheben. And I saw these three ideas as being illustrative or a metaphor for the photographic, meaning to preserve. The impulse to photograph is to this drive to preserve something, but then that moment of exposure or moment of taking the image, you elevate the object, but then at the same time there's this cancellation because then you're taking it out of the context of experience. And so I saw that as a way of thinking through my relationship to photography and helped me to think about a structure for this work.
So I have a follow-up question. Well, my next sort of related question is this idea of the intergenerational in relation to the Asian American home, and maybe Arthur, you can say a bit more about that with your series that was in the Aperture issue, these photographs of your daughter, and I think each of the other panelists, I think you also engage with your family members, your parents. Miraj, you have a portrait of your brother, just different generations of Asian Americans in one space, and the kind of tensions and contradictions, but also maybe invention and kind of beauty that comes with that. But do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah. So yeah, I started these in 2020, and I was curious about children around this age of 5 and 7, and I noticed in my daughter Octavia at the time, who was 5, who was asking a lot of questions about the place that we lived and the city that we lived in and the country, and so these increasingly larger scales of spaces that we think about, that we inhabit, and so I was thinking about photographing children in this moment of looking, and in this moment of looking at something that's off frame, and in this way that's performative, and a gesture that points to something that is thinking about their own imaginations of where they are. So again, back to this idea of the using photography to orient oneself, or using vision to orient oneself. And so I started with my daughter, and then started to photograph other children from the neighborhood, but always within this age bracket of 5 and 7.
It's interesting because I guess you yourselves are coming from different generations within an Asian American home. But yet, do you guys want to say something about this intergenerational element of the home and how you approach that?
I got a question for Jarod. How's it working with your little brother?
I think it's probably exactly how it is when you work with your little brother. It's really difficult.
Well, Miraj, we have a photo of your brother here.
Yeah, I think working with different generations, especially my little brother, is difficult. But also, I think he was born here, right? So it's interesting being able to see. I mean, I don't think he fully understands it, right? He's 16, so he doesn't fully understand our differences. But as he's gotten older, it becomes clear to him how different his experience is, and in that way, I feel like I can relate more to my parents than I can maybe perhaps my little brother, which sucks because I feel like that's kind of why I wanted a little sibling. but yeah, I don't know.
You had mentioned that he maybe has a different relationship to the house than you, maybe more comfortable, and you can maybe tell in his body language here in this photo, he's quite relaxed, he's lounging, and it's a bit of a contrast from how you are behaving in the house.
Yeah. It definitely is, definitely. I think that comes off, and I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with that is he's definitely far more comfortable with his congruent experience, whereas mine wasn't really like that. And it's it's just different. I don't know if I think it's good or better or what, but it's fascinating being able to see that, yeah.
Okay, so I think we have just a couple minutes left, but so we're going to save that for questions from the audience. I think maybe Alex will go around with a mic. If anyone wants to ask any of the artists anything.
Yeah, thanks, great panel. Jarod, I wanted you to maybe explicate on this very interesting phrase, which is the idea of performing Asian Americanness, as I might have written it wrong, but an ability to shut off performing the skin. Do you remember saying that?
I said a lot today. What's the... Yes.
I think the context was what makes an image Asian American.
Correct.
And you said something to the effect of to turn the camera around or something like that.
It was to turn the face around. So
turn the face
when I was making portraits of my friends or strangers, I kept coming, like we would be in a room making a photograph, and you would notice that there's a bunch of punk rock posters, a lot of European art, and then the whole time while I'm making portraits of my friends, I would, kept thinking, like, what happens if I turned their face around? What would describe this image as, an Asian American image? And it wasn't until after leaving that bedroom or that room where I was making these photographs, I started to think that I was the most Asian thing in the room and they were the most Asian thing in the room, and then leaving that space and going into their parents' public space, the parents' living room, which was decorated in Chinese ornaments, Chinese objects. You almost felt like you were the least Asian thing in this room. So I really started to create portraiture and photographs that kind of described that alienation between going from one place to another,
I mean, I'm still very stuck on this phrase, which I think is really beautiful and really complex, to turn the face around, right? So it's as if you were saying, if everything that is photographed, the surroundings, if that could see what's behind this, or what can look at this face and have that be a type of index to Asian Americanness. Is that what you mean?
To a certain extent, yeah.
I mean, it doesn't matter if you don't explicate it. I just think it's very beautiful and it's very interesting. It's a rich thing to think about.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, all of you. Miraj, could you say a little more about your reaction to Larry Sultan's photos and why you were like, that's not me, and what you were trying to do that wasn't that?
Yeah, I think it's become more clear over the years, and I feel like having time the last 2 years to study and kind of spend time doing some research, I feel like learning the history of the camera and how it's such an imperial tool, and how in it, whether it's subjecting people or whether it's Larry Sultan making pictures of his family, in it creates some sort of expectation, right, of what our roles are. And in it, seeing that project, it was it made a lot of the media maybe I've consumed as a kid, right? Whether it was public television or what, and seeing the lack of representation maybe of people that look like me in it. Larry Sultan wasn't necessarily the one thing, but it was kind of that aha moment. And in it, it felt like in a sense, maybe my parents, and through them assimilating here and being an adult, maybe it wasn't necessarily seeing Larry Sultan's book for them, but it was this idea of what they were supposed to do, what they were supposed to look like, right? And I feel maybe Larry Sultan's book kind of disrupted that for a white audience, in the time it came out, but that wasn't the presence for me at all, So in it, it felt important maybe even to maybe that rebellion thing that you were talking about was also along the lines of making fun of the camera in a sense, and the way that it boxes in this idea of what's expected of people or something, you know? Yeah.
This is questions for anyone really, but I'm curious, in photographing Asian America or Asian American experience, is there anything that's off limits that you like will not photograph?
I mean, I've been asked before why I don't really dive into the Vincent Chin history with this work or with any work, and I think like for me, I don't want to make photographs or work about the hypervisibility of racial violence. So I think for me, that's like an off limit. I think my work is about more, joy within the community, relatable experiences within the community, and I want like folks and viewers to interact with the images. I want them to be, I want the photographs to trigger memories of their own experience in their own childhood home, and have that like be a relatable and inspiring experience. And yeah, so I think like anything about violence is something I like try to stay away from. I don't know.
Oh, that's a tough question. I think that, I would agree that violence would be something that would be difficult to image, and yeah, I think in terms of, I've never photographed my parents in a formal way, and I every time I have an idea to do that, I think about how I can, like what would be the best way to represent them through the medium, but to use the occasion to somehow respond to their present. And I think I get stuck on the best way to do that, and so I stop. And so I think, I guess mostly that's why I work with objects and think about how to represent them through the things that they have. And so it's not really responding to your question, but I think portraiture, in the images with the kids, I think that's why I don't show their eyes, and that's why there's this obstruction, and that it's directing the gaze outward. It's still a presence of a young person, but it's not showing them directly. So yeah, so I think about those things as not so much off limits, but as a challenge to show a person's presence without showing them directly.
Yeah, I think this is a really fitting question for the theme of our conversation of staying in, because I think the parameters of staying in is that you're actually deliberately not imaging certain things that are so public and so visible. I think what Jarod said actually really touched also at the heart of my piece for Aperture, hypervisibility of violence. You don't have to photograph it because it's everywhere. I think especially in the COVID era, we're saturated with images of racial trauma and violence and injury. And I think kind of the excerpt that I read at the opening is about, staying in is not turning away from this history, but it's actually seeing it on a more daily basis and, looking at history in quotidian time, looking at Asian American life in the long stretch of time in between historical flashpoints. And I think that's what I find so moving about all of your work, is that it's really about the sustained mode of looking, and staying in as, kind of what I was explaining, the obverse to something like the public self-definition of Asian American, the Asian American movement in '68. It's sort of the necessary other half to this very public movement of self-definition, and something that doesn't receive enough attention, I think. So I'm hoping this can be just the beginning of maybe a reorientation and turning towards these other ways of looking and more attention to things like interiority and staying in. And I think maybe we're at time now, but if you have other questions, I think we'll be up here for a while. But I think, I just want to thank all the panelists and everyone else here for coming and making this such a great conversation. Thank you.